since he was just a skinny little teenager, only 14 years old, growing up in the town of Alcalá, South Carolina, back in 1944. George Stinney Jr. was tending to the family's cow with his little sister in this field near an old set of railroad tracks when they crossed paths with two young white girls looking for flowers. George's sister remembers it clearly.
They said, "Could you tell us where we could find some maypops?" We said no. And they went on about their business.
They were the last known to see the girls alive. A coroner's report at the time describes a vicious murder. 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames were beaten to death.
In the annals of American legal history, the case of George Junius Stinney Jr. stands as a haunting reminder of a tragic miscarriage of justice. George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old African-American boy, was wrongfully accused, hastily tried, and unjustly executed in the midst of racial tensions and a flawed legal system. This video aims to shed light on this case and the circumstances that led to a grave injustice. George Junius Stinney Jr. was born on October 21, 1929 in Pinewood, South Carolina, a time and place deeply entrenched in racial segregation and discrimination. At the time of the incident, the 14-year-old African-American boy lived with his family in the small town of Alcalá, South Carolina. With Jim Crow laws in effect, white and black populations were separated and lived on opposite sides of the railway tracks. Stinney's father worked at the lumber mill in the town, and the family lived in company housing until young Stinney was falsely convicted. On March 24, 1944, tragedy struck when two young white girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, were brutally murdered while searching for flowers. This horrifying incident would change Stinney's life forever. In a climate of racial tension and fear, George Stinney Jr. was accused of the murders, mainly due to the color of his skin. Law enforcement officers arrested him and his older brother Johnny, but released Johnny due to lack of evidence. George Stinney Jr. was the only suspect. The disappearance prompted hundreds of residents, including George Stinney's father, to come together and search for the two missing girls. But the girls wouldn't be located until the following day, when the bodies were discovered in a ditch. According to the medical examiner, both girls suffered blunt force trauma caused by an unknown weapon. While specifics of what happened that day remained unknown, a rumor floated around town that the girls had made a stop at a prominent white family's home on the day of the murder. But none of this has ever been confirmed, and police certainly never looked for a white killer. As a community search party approached Stinney, he reportedly acknowledged seeing the girls earlier in the day when they asked him and his 8-year-old sister, Amie, if they had seen any wildflowers. Upon learning of the girls' deaths, police arrested 14-year-old Stinney, who, while in custody, allegedly confessed to the murders. Other than this supposed confession, which ended up being made up by the officers, there was no other physical evidence nor any witnesses to testify to his guilt.
Multiple severe head injuries suggested the killer used a hammer. The Stinney family fled in fear after police came for little George.
They were looking for somebody to blame it on. So they used my brother as a scapegoat.
George was interrogated in a small room for a few hours without his parents or an attorney, despite the Sixth Amendment assurance of legal counsel. Stinney was still charged and stood trial a month later. The odds were stacked pretty heavily against poor George. Despite being surrounded by white policemen who believed he was a murderer, his family wasn't even allowed in the courtroom or the interrogation room. The questioning was relentless. The officers screamed at him, forcing him to admit his guilt, and failed. Hours upon hours of mental assault, George had no choice but to endure everything by himself. No lawyer, no family, just alone. A publicly provided attorney, Charles Plowden, didn't seem really interested in proving the innocence of his client. The trial took place on April 24, 1944, a mere 84 days after the murders. Yet his attorney called no witnesses to the stand, cross-examined nobody, and most of all, he didn't even bother to look at the evidence that could prove his client's innocence. His guilt was completely circumstantial and without proper legal procedure. All they had against the kid is that he talked to the girls the same day they died. George Stinney Jr. faced an all-white jury consisting of 12 men. George's family wasn't allowed to attend. The trial lasted only a few hours, and the defense did little to challenge the prosecution's case.
He was carrying a Bible. By the way, just if you're not absolutely clear yet that he didn't do it, historian in 2004 took this case on and investigated it further and found out that there was a wealthy white family in the area who said that the real culprit did a deathbed confession and said that he had killed the two young girls. And a member of that family was part of the process that picked Stinney as the real culprit.
Shockingly, there were no written records of the trial proceedings, and no official transcript was ever produced. The evidence against Stinney was flimsy and circumstantial at best. No physical evidence linked him to the crime scene, and there were no witnesses to testify against him. Stinney's conviction was largely based on a coerced confession, questionable police tactics, and an alibi that was never properly investigated. Stinney's alleged confession was a crucial piece of evidence used against him. However, it is widely believed to have been coerced. The exact details of how the confession was obtained remain unclear, but it's documented that Stinney was interrogated without the presence of his parents or legal representation, a clear violation of his rights. When the news spread that the two white girls were killed by a black boy, this led to an uproar in the white community. Both the boy and his family were lynched. As a result, George was held in a secret location so that even during his last days, his family couldn't see him. They didn't even know where he was. As George's execution day approached, his family's life was changing for the worst. Wanting to have no connection with a convicted murderer, the company George's father worked for fired him. George's execution wasn't without protest. Ministerial unions of all races petitioned on his behalf. Among the arguments they raised were the ethics of killing a child, Christian morality, and the justice of the trial and conviction. Several letters and telegrams were sent to the governor's office requesting clemency, but they were all ignored. Shockingly, on the same day as the trial, George Stinney Jr. was sentenced to death by electrocution. His execution would take place on June 16, 1944, making him the youngest person in the United States in the 20th century to be executed. George's parents were able to see him one more time before his execution, and his minister was allowed to see him and grant him his last rites as a death row inmate. George was marched to the electric chair while holding his trusty Bible cradled to his chest, while being accompanied by his minister. Because he was a child, they had difficulties setting him up in the electric chair as it was designed for adults. They took the Bible from George and used it as a booster for his seat. They asked George if he had any final words, and he simply shook his head. After strapping his hands and legs, they pulled a strap around his mouth, and George began to cry. Then they placed an ill-fitted adult mask over his head, and the signal was given. 2,400 volts were sent through his body, and George Stinney passed away with people in attendance to see it happen. In 2014, more than 7 decades after Stinney's execution, his conviction was posthumously vacated by Circuit Judge Carmen Mullen. She cited fundamental rights violations, including a lack of due process and inadequate defense representation. This decision aimed to acknowledge the injustice and offer some semblance of justice for George Stinney Jr. George's siblings always believed he was innocent. They were overjoyed to be able to live and witness their brother's name being acquitted after 70 years, though it comes as a cold comfort for the grave injustice they suffered. George Junius Stinney Jr.'s tragic story remains a glaring example of the injustices faced by African Americans during a dark period in American history.
And And listening to the family on the stand today, they draw a picture of a case in which critical evidence seemed to be completely overlooked in this rush to judgment. They pointed out in a crime like this, there would have been a great deal of blood, and yet they found no blood anywhere on their brother's clothing. Don?
The obvious question, David, why did it take 70 years for this case to go back to court?
This was a very slow-moving thing, but it continued to build over the decades. At first, the family was afraid to speak out. They actually had to leave their home. The siblings were talking on the stand today about how they had to leave in fear that a mob might show up to do them all harm after their brother was arrested. So they left in fear and didn't talk about it for a while. But they continued to keep the conversation going, and it took decades for them to find people to listen, to be curious, and to actually start doing research on this. They actually came up with some potential witnesses to bolster their case, including one man who was the cellmate of their brother, who said the young man at the time said that he did not do this and that he was forced into a confession.
The rushed trial, the absence of proper legal representation, and the blatant racism that marked his case are reminders of the importance of a fair and just legal system. It is crucial that we remember George Stinney Jr.'s story and work towards a society that upholds justice and equality for all, regardless of race or background. May his memory serve as a beacon to ensure that such injustices are never repeated.